Hello, my name is Aaron Fields, and this is my main course for INFA 739 Advanced Web Hacking with Dr. Josh Pauli in the spring of 2012. I seem to have caught a cold again just in time for this presentation, so that's great. So bear with me on that. But anyway, we're going to be talking about Duqu today. Basically, we're going to be talking about the tilted development platform. We're going to be going over Stuxnet for just a little bit. Then we're going to be talking about Duqu in particular, how it works, who it works on, who works on it, and some other random facts and theories about Duqu. Then we're going to have a little recap, a little bit of a conclusion, and some questions. So here's the deal. We really only know a little bit about Stuxnet, and we really only know a little bit about Duqu, or as it's sometimes called, Stuxnet 2.0, or even son of Stuxnet. Now, there are a lot of people who think that the same people who developed Stuxnet were the same people who worked on and developed Duqu. As we'll see later, that theory may or may not be correct, as there's really a lot of evidence pointing towards collaboration on these two pieces of malware, and a lot of evidence against it. The bottom line is, we really don't know for sure who created either piece of malware, or if they worked together on it. There are some suspects, but there's no strong evidence to support those suspicions. But we do know, thanks to some research that Kaspersky did, that it's very, very likely that both Duqu and Stuxnet were developed using the same platform, which is known as Tilted, or tilde-d. Tilted got its name from its interesting naming convention. Many file names that tilde-based malware creates are prefixed with a tilde and a d, right? So pretty original. The Tilted development platform has been around for many years. It's estimated that it's been under development since at least sometime in 2007, and we know that because of compiler timestamps in drivers that are used in Stuxnet and Duqu. Now, a sort of scary thought about this whole Tilted platform is that to date we've only discovered two pieces of malware that were developed using it, Stuxnet and Duqu. It is certainly possible that there are other Tilted-based pieces of malware floating around out there right now, even though we have no idea they even exist. Tilted has been undergoing constant updates since its inception. Some of the biggest and most frequent updates happened in the latter part of 2010, but there is some evidence that it's still being updated and used even still today. Tilted got its name from its interesting naming convention. Many file names that tilde-based malware creates are prefixed with a tilde and a d, right? So pretty original. The Tilted development platform has been around for many years. It's estimated that it's been under development since at least sometime in 2007, and we know that because of compiler timestamps in drivers that are used in Stuxnet and Duqu. Now, a sort of scary thought about this whole Tilted platform is that to date we've only discovered two pieces of malware that were developed using it, Stuxnet and Duqu. It is certainly possible that there are other Tilted-based pieces of malware floating around out there right now, even though we have no idea they even exist. Tilted has been undergoing constant updates since its inception. Some of the biggest and most frequent updates happened in the latter part of 2010, but there is some evidence that it's still being updated and used even still today. I do just want to point out some of the blatant, kind of high-level similarities and differences that are obvious between Stuxnet and Duqu. For similarities, they both share many of the same code fragments, and they basically have the same setup or modus operandi, which we'll kind of talk about and see in just a little bit. Some of the most obvious differences, though, is that Stuxnet is very, very malicious, right? It's a self-propagating piece of malware, and it takes advantage of no less than 4 Windows 0 days. Fortunately, all of those have been patched since the Stuxnet ordeal. But it would spread throughout systems. It would basically lay dormant on systems unless it found itself on a very specific SCADA system. Once it's on one of those systems, it activates, and it has the capability of destroying that SCADA system by overriding certain controls within the system. It had a very high number of infections, but really it had a pretty low number of actual valid targets. Duqu, however, is not obviously malicious. It's basically known for its info stealer module and for doing things like screen captures and key logging. It's essentially a reconnaissance program. It just gathers information and sends it back home. Also, Duqu is not self-propagating like Stuxnet is. Duqu was spread through a 0-day vulnerability in Microsoft Word. So targets received an email with a Word document, opened it up, and boom, Duqu is on their system. Only about 50 targets received these emails. So it was a very, very low number of infections, but all of the targets were very specific. Also, each of those targets were sent a unique copy of Duqu. No two copies of Duqu, so far at least, have been found to be exactly the same. So let's talk about the tilted modus operandi. There's a driver. There's actually a ton of different drivers out there that are used in the tilted development platform, and many of them have been signed using valid, stolen certificates in order to bypass Windows security controls. I just want to point out that if you visit the image, the link to the image posted in this slide, you'll find a sweet timeline of the tilted driver development timeline. So anyway, the driver loads what's known as the main module, and essentially this is an encrypted library, so think like a DLL or PNF file. There's also a separate config file included with this malware to help control the whole shebang, as well as an encrypted block that gets loaded into the registry. That encrypted block contains the location of the module or DLL to load, as well as the name of the target process to inject that DLL into. That's basically kind of the 50,000 foot view of the tilted D development platform and how it works. Now we'll transition into a little bit of the background of Stuxnet in specific. So this piece of malware was first discovered in June of 2010. It's very, very sophisticated, arguably the most complex malware known to date. It had a very specific target. It would actually check to see if the system it was running on was running any of Siemens programming logic controllers. So basically, it was looking for Iran's nuclear plants. It's estimated that, based on the compiler timestamps in the driver files, that development on Stuxnet began as early as 2007 or 2008. Who developed it? Nobody really knows, and of course nobody is willing to admit that they were the developer. The way Stuxnet works basically is it lands on a system and it checks to see if it's a Siemens system. If it is, it messes with a piece of software running on that system known as Organizational Block 35. Organizational Block 35 is what monitors, quote, critical factory operations, unquote. So basically Stuxnet decides to change some settings in Organizational Block 35, and those settings changes cause the centrifuge to malfunction, right? So explosion, basically. Stuxnet was targeting specific systems related to refineries. Initial infections of Stuxnet were spread using USB flash drives and malicious PDF files. Stuxnet took advantage of no less than 4 0-day exploits for Windows, which have all since been patched. One of the 0 days was related to the way that Windows handles shortcuts. That was MS-10 046. And another one was related to the printer spooler, and that one was MS-10062. There were also two elevation of privilege vulnerabilities that it took advantage of to allow it to run itself with elevated privileges. Also, go figure, with USB flash drives, it took advantage of auto run. Surprise, surprise, right? There were at least 4 variants of Stuxnet drivers that were discovered, and they were signed with one of 2 different certificates stolen either from Realtek or the other one was stolen from J Micron. Stuxnet also used a custom proprietary peer-to-peer communication system to relay information and commands. Whoever developed Stuxnet knew a scary amount of information about industrial systems. Like, they had to know the details of refinement management software like WinCC and PCS7. And to be honest, it would be next to impossible to write malware that was as effective as Stuxnet without some kind of physical access to actual refinement hardware to test some malware on. Like, especially you conspiracy theorists out there, like, I would recommend reading up on this because it's really kind of a crazy thought, right? That they had to have actual access to this hardware. I do want to point out, however, that once on the system, Stuxnet took advantage of WinCC and PCS7 by using default credentials to log into those programs. So that is pretty sad. Like I mentioned earlier, Stuxnet had a very high number of infections. Just a few days ago, actually, Iran announced that at least 16,000 machines had been owned by Stuxnet. However, they did not specify whether that was a worldwide number or if that was just how many had been infected in Iran. But either way, that's quite a few machines, especially when compared with Duqu. Also, kind of a random fact, but Stuxnet was at least half a megabyte in size, and that's really pretty big for a piece of malware. Also, the 2 primary suspects, by no means are they confirmed, but the 2 primary suspects are the United States and Israel for the developers of Stuxnet. So yeah, that was just a pretty brief background on Stuxnet. So now we're going to dig a little deeper into Duqu. Before we start, I do just want to mention 2 things. First, this is an incredibly complex piece of malware, and so I wasn't able to go as in-depth or as technical with this as I would have liked to. And second, there is an obnoxious amount of information out there on both Stuxnet and Duqu. So, you know, when you're trying to keep a talk to about 45 minutes or less, it makes it really tough to pick and choose what information you actually want to share and which information is actually important. So I try to do my best, but I would really recommend spending some time on your own, doing some reading on Stuxnet and Duqu, because there's just way more information out there than I could ever cover in a video like this. So with that said, let's move on to Duqu. It first started popping up on radars in about September of 2011, so not terribly long ago. And it's really interesting how Kaspersky, which is one of the primary antivirus companies who was doing research on Duqu in the past couple months, it's really interesting how Kaspersky came upon Duqu. From what I understand, essentially somebody at Kaspersky came across a forum post by some Hungarian server administrator who had found a suspicious binary on his system. He took an MD5 hash of the file, posted it, and he said, like, I'm looking for friends or foes of this MD5 because I want to know more about it and what it does. So stuff just kind of took off from there. Like I mentioned earlier, there were only about 50 reported infections of Duqu, at least as of November 16, 2011. So Duqu consists of basically 4 main parts, as is consistent with the tilted framework. There's a dropper, a driver, which injects a DLL into services.exe. That DLL itself contains an additional module, which we'll talk about in a bit, and the DLL also interacts with the command and control centers, which we'll talk about in a bit as well. And there's also the 4th part, the configuration file. So this is a visual diagram of how Duqu infects a machine. If you remember, Duqu was spread via Word documents that were sent in emails. It takes advantage of a vulnerability in the way that Windows handles certain TTF fonts. So basically everything needed for Duqu to run is contained within a Word document. When that document's opened, it triggers the exploit, which runs shellcode. Shellcode decrypts a driver and an installer, and it actually runs the driver as well. So once the driver is running, it injects the installer into services.exe on the victim machine. The installer then decrypts 3 more files. So the main Duqu DLL, the load point driver, and the configuration file, loads those into memory and then passes execution onto the main Duqu DLL. I wasn't able to find a whole lot of detail on the nitty-gritties of the Microsoft Word zero-day exploit, which is also known as MS11087, or known by its CVE 2011-3402. But I was able to confirm that it affects basically all Windows systems, including server editions, all the way back from Windows XP Service Pack 2 up to Windows 7 Service Pack 1, right? So basically, if you're running Windows, like, you are vulnerable to Duqu. And on 32-bit systems, because of the way that this exploit takes advantage of the system and executes, address space layout randomization and data execution prevention are absolutely worthless. From what I read, it's a little bit tougher to exploit 64-bit systems, but it is certainly possible if the attacker is using return-oriented programming in order to take advantage of the system. You guys can look up return-oriented programming later if you don't know what it is. It's a method for running arbitrary code. This is a kernel-level exploit, and suffice to say, it is super complex. Like, if you remember how the developers of Stuxnet probably had access to an actual refinement centrifuge in order to test their malware, like, kind of the same story here. In order to figure out how to make this exploit work, the developer had to have either had access to the Windows kernel source code, or, man, they have just unheard of intuition when it comes to writing exploits. Because this is, like, again, I'm not able to go into as much technical detail as I'd like to for the sake of time, but, like, look this up outside of this video. Like, it's absolutely insane just how intricate this exploit actually is. One other interesting thing too is that this attack can actually be triggered from both Word documents as well as through Internet Explorer. So imagine that, right? So the link down at the bottom is where I got most of the information on the MS Word O-Day. Really smart guy who wrote this blog, and he was actually almost going to post some proof of concept code on how to actually exploit this vulnerability, but he decided to not to due to ethical reasons. So kind of sad day there, but I suppose that's actually a good thing. Kind of a sucky thing about this malware is that it's very hard to detect. There were at least 3 different drivers discovered as of October 20, 2011, but there were a lot more discovered after that even. There's also different modules contained inside of the DLLs with each Duqu infection. Like, they're not all the same. There are different encryption keys that were used. There was at least 2 different encryption keys, but there's probably way more than that. Also, they all, like, each specific Duqu infection used a different command and control center to phone home to. So there were at least 12 of these servers discovered to be in use over the past 3 years, but it's actually suspected that there's 1 command and control center for each and every Duqu infection. So lots and lots of servers, each one different. So the dropper, which is shellcode, right, loads and runs the driver. Once loaded, the driver will decrypt an installer, and it adds some values to the registry, one for itself. It adds a path to the DLL that is to be injected, and also adds an entry for the target process to be injected into. So in the case of Duqu, that's always services.exe. But once it's all done and initialized, the driver will actually inject the PNF DLL, also known as the main Duqu DLL, which we mentioned earlier, into services.exe, as well as a stub executable, which is later used as a loader to load new Duqu modules into memory. So the PNF DLL contains either 6 or 8 functions, and that kind of depends on which version your particular instance of Duqu came with. But generally speaking, export 2 runs export 6, but in a separate process. Export 4 does the same thing as export 2, except it runs export 5 in a separate process. So export 6 kills Duqu and completely removes Duqu from the system, and export 5 starts a thread in services.exe, and if it's given the correct parameters, it'll actually install new Duqu modules or components. Exports 8 and 1 are kind of the main functions in the PNF DLL. They initialize the DLL and are kind of what start the main threads and processes of Duqu. So like I said, export 1 is basically the primary function that kind of gets the Duqu ball rolling. It loads information from the config file, which is also a PNF file, so it's just called the PNF config file. If it can't find that PNF file, it'll actually load a hard copy of the config file from a copy stored within itself. So crazy, right? Some versions of the PNF DLL will also actually start kind of a Stuxnet-esque remote procedure call or RPC server as well. The PNF config file, essentially all it does is writes a timestamp to a file that I think is located on the physical disk. But basically it says, this is when Duqu started, right? It's a timestamp. It then starts a separate time till live TTL thread, and basically, like if X number of days have passed, and in most cases of Duqu, it was initially set to 36 days, but sometimes it was 30 days. It kind of varied. But anyway, if X number of days have passed, it'll call the aforementioned export 6 and just completely nuke Duqu off of the system. The PNF config file also may or may not contain some flags concerning something called the 302 resource. The 302 resource is contained within the PNF DLL as well. And essentially this resource has two options. One of them is chosen based upon the flags in the PNF config file. The first option basically instantiates a DLL loader module that is then injected into lsas.exe and /or even some antivirus products. The second option is what was called a block of Z data, and I can only assume that a block of Z data is a block of compressed or zipped data from like a PE header, but to be honest, I'm not really sure. I'm probably just a noob and don't understand this, so if you know, let me know. but I didn't have any luck figuring out what was actually meant by the term .zdata. But anyway, this Z data is decompressed and then injected into Firefox, Internet Explorer, or SVC host, and basically this code is in charge of communicating with the command and control servers. It also contains what was called a configuration block, and basically that defines a file in which to store temporary information concerning the command and control center servers. So the whole Duqu payload consists of about 256 kilobytes of C++ code, and so that's capable of connecting to remote command and control centers using the WinHTTP library or the network share interprocess communication protocol. It can act as an HTTP server to process requests that are sent to it by command and control centers. It can also load external DLLs from the command and control center, so things like the INFA module, which is capable of taking screenshots, recording keystrokes, capturing a list of running software or processes, etc. It can update the TTL in the PNF DLL, right? So it can extend the amount of time that Duqu will be active on a system. It can read network configurations, disk configurations, like hard disk configurations, lots of stuff. It's like I said earlier, it's essentially a reconnaissance piece of malware. Supposedly, also, it can create a PNF DLL that can be used in distribution to other potential victims down the road. So now we're going to kind of transition from the kind of client-side aspect of Duqu over to the server side, talking about the command and control centers. So the client and the servers communicate on their own custom protocol, which essentially consists of uploading and downloading JPEG images. So this is pretty interesting because there's a little bit of steganography going on, which is kind of cool. There have been over a dozen active servers that have been identified in the past 3 years, and they are all over the place, all over the world. India, Belgium, Vietnam, Germany, the UK, even other countries besides that. And interesting thing though is on October 20 of 2011, like all the servers were just suddenly wiped clean. And there really wasn't much data left on them because whoever was administering these machines or whoever had control of these machines really did a pretty good job at covering up their tracks. However, researchers were able to find a little bit of information that was still left on them. One of the servers, server A, was found by Kaspersky researchers located in, or the server was located in Vietnam. It was suspected of controlling Duqu infections that were based in Iran. So this server was running CentOS 5.5, which is of interest because all of the Duqu command and control centers that have been found so far have been running either CentOS 5.4, I believe, or 5.5. So the root directory of this machine, as well as the log directory, they were both basically empty. But these researchers were able to recover parts of the SSHD log file off the disk, even though it had been deleted. So within this file, they were able to find two authentications to the machine. One occurred in July of 2011, and during that session, OpenSSH was upgraded to the newest version at the time, which is also interesting because in every other machine that has been found so far, SSH has been upgraded. Second authentication occurred in October of 2011, just right before the machine was wiped. Right, so it can only be assumed that it was during that session that the machine was nuked. So other than that, there really wasn't a whole lot of useful information found on this particular machine. there was a second server that was analyzed, and this one was in Germany. It was owned and operated by a Bulgarian hosting company. It was also running CentOS, and it was also nuked on October 20, 2011. Now this machine was logged into a very long time ago. Right, they did kind of the same thing. They were able to recover some logs, and it turns out that this machine was logged into in November of 2009. And the attacker upgraded OpenSSH again, and the only other thing they tried to do on this machine was they attempted to redirect ports on the machine. So that's actually really interesting because, as it turns out, these machines really aren't actually command and control centers. They're actually just proxies, and all they do is route traffic from Duqu zombies to the real command and control centers. And kind of the mystery here is that nobody knows where the real servers are, if they're even still operational, or who operates them. So yeah, this is really kind of a pointless visualization, to be honest. It's just a geographical map of where some known victims were, where they were communicating to. So there's a server in Iran that was communicating with one of the command and control centers that was analyzed by Kaspersky. But like the bottom line is nobody actually knows where the main command and control centers are at. There is a question of how these, proxy command and control centers originally got owned, right? Because the attackers didn't own they didn't control these machines to begin with. They attacked them and got into them remotely. So it's interesting because every single machine that was a command and control center was immediately updated to the most recent version of OpenSSH as soon as it was owned and the attacker was in there running commands. And so because of that, there are some people out there who are pretty confident that whoever is behind Duqu was actually using a 0-day to take advantage of certain versions of OpenSSH to get into these machines. Other people are pretty confident that the Duqu operators have an O-day for CentOS, since all of the machines that were owned were running either CentOS 5.4 or 5.5. So in all honesty, it wouldn't surprise me one bit if they had O-days for OpenSSH or CentOS or both, especially if this was done by the same people who were in charge of Stuxnet, right? Because Stuxnet operators had 4 0-days for Windows, right? They just got a bag full of O-days, and it's no big deal. It is a big deal, but there is solid evidence on some of the machines, however, of brute force password guessing. So I mean, that's pretty simple. It's pretty loud, but it works. And so 2 just kind of random facts that I wanted to share with you guys. on one of the logs recovered from a different command and control center than either of the two that I talked about previously. The researchers were actually able to recover a bash history file, and so they saw some of the commands that the attackers were running, and it's interesting because the attackers didn't really know how to use IP tables. Like, they were using incorrect flags. They had to run the command multiple times to figure stuff out. Like, they had to use the man pages for IP tables as well as other programs. And so, like, that's just weird because you'd think that they would be good with Linux, right? I don't know. The other fact, there was a command and control center that was found in India, and the company that was hosting the server was contacted and asked to take an image of the machine so that it could be analyzed. And they did take an image, but they took just a little bit too long. Like, the machine got nuked, right? And they missed it by just like a couple hours. And so, I mean, I don't know. Coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? But either way, that sucks because we were really close to having potentially a lot of information on the back end of the Duqu command and control platform. And so, I mean, we're really getting into the question of like who is really behind Duqu. And a lot of people are saying it's not necessarily the same people who are behind Stuxnet, since Duqu's mission is so different from Stuxnet's. But in my opinion, it's probably at least the same group. Maybe not the same individuals, but at least the same group. And I just say that because, I mean, Duqu is using the exact same platform, and there are just too many other similarities and connections for it to be, purely coincidental. Just a random example, Stuxnet has a constant integer representing the date of May 9, 1979. And on that date, a prominent Jewish businessman from Iran was executed by a firing squad in Tehran. Duqu has an integer that's very close to that date. It starts with hex of AE instead of 19, right? As you can see in the slides. And so at first people were like, oh, like it's not the same, so like there's no connection there. But it was later found that Stuxnet actually contains that same AE790509 variable that Duqu contains, right? So maybe that's chance, maybe not. I don't know. Duqu has another strange number, AE240682. So this integer is used in the decryption process. Corresponds to June 24, 1982, which was an interesting date. On that day, British Airways Flight 9 happened. This incident happened where a plane full of passengers nearly crashed after flying through a volcanic ash cloud. Like, the engines shut down, weren't able to run. Everybody ended up living. They were able to get the engines restarted, but it was a really close call. So I mean, just another weird thing, the font that Duqu uses in the Word document is called Dexter Regular, and this isn't a real font, it's just what they decided to name the font, and it says that the font was made by Showtime Incorporated, copyright 2003, right? So we've got some Dexter fans on our hands, or maybe just sociopathic serial killers, like, who knows, right? Like, it's just random. But here, this might be a clue. This is actually the image that Duqu uses to, or uses when it communicates with the command and control servers. It's a image from the Hubble telescope of interacting galaxy system NGC 6745. It's supposed to be like the aftermath of two galaxies that collided, billions of years ago or whatever. So I mean, like maybe Duqu is, maybe the people behind that are aliens who are looking to steal our protein and chloroform, and they're performing some recon before they come in and attack. I'm kidding, but seriously. No, really, I'm kidding. But anyway, just want to do a little bit of recap here. Stuxnet, right? It was self-propagating. It found SCADA stuff and it destroyed it. Duqu did not self-propagate. It had a very targeted scope, only about 50 infections in the countries of Austria, Iran, Sudan, and even America, and presumably other countries as well. Each infection had different file names, checksums, command and control centers, etc. There's a different encryption key that was used for each installation of Duqu. And it's interesting, like a lot of people kind of believe that Duqu was built off Stuxnet's mistakes, because Stuxnet did self-propagate, and so because of that, it could become, and it did become, very hard to control because it just spread like nuts. So Duqu didn't do that, right? Duqu was primarily intended for information gathering, and so its two main targets ended up actually being certificate authorities, and so you can imagine that that would be useful down the road, right? If they're able to steal certificates, they can sign malware and bypass a lot of Windows security controls. And they also infected a number of industrial control manufacturers. So Stuxnet and Duqu were very similar in a lot of respects. You know, they shared the same code fragments, same modus operandi. You know, the tilted platform. You know, they had common mysterious integers, and nobody really knows for sure who was behind either of these pieces of malware. So a lot of people are kind of like, oh boy, conspiracy, you know, like, because it had to have been a nation state who developed this malware, right? It's too big, too complex, would have taken too much time and too many resources for it not to have been a nation state. And then what's kind of scary too is the whole ~D platform, right? Like there could be malware floating around out there right now still that we just don't even know about. And I did want to mention too, before we wrap up here, that Microsoft did release a fix for the O-Day that Duqu exploited. They actually first released a temporary kind of like workaround fix in November of 2011, and basically what it did was remove access to the t2embed.dll, and basically that DLL was responsible for displaying true type fonts, and so it just removed the ability to do that. So that fixed the vulnerability for the time being. They did release an official patch on December 13 of 2011 that was a permanent fix that, you know, still allowed users to display those fonts, but in a safe manner. So if you have any questions, you know, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Like, it would actually be really sweet if people, you know, just kind of posted their questions and maybe started some discussions in the comments down below. I mean, like, who do you think is behind this malware? And what do you think about all those zero-day exploits? Like, I don't know about you, but that's pretty freaking scary. You know, that Stuxnet 4 O-days, Duqu at least 1 O-day, potentially 2 more. You know, for OpenSSH and CentOS, like crazy. And what do you think is going to happen next? A lot of people are saying that Duqu is a precursor to another Stuxnet attack, right? Like, it's gathering all this information so that the next Stuxnet will be even better and more effective and more stealthy. I mean, like, maybe that'll happen, maybe it won't. But I would love to know what you think about that. So, yeah, been kind of a long video. A little bit different than normal because I didn't have any demos, and I usually like to do some sort of demo. So, yeah, just kind of a different talk. But I hope you enjoyed it. Glad you made it this far. And thanks for watching.